Before we move on to episode 205 of the special Last Dance edition of the Hard Parking Podcast, gotta let you know about Talk Mobile. Talk Mobile is an innovator in retail and works with organizations like T-Mobile, operates stores throughout Arizona, Oklahoma, Kansas, and Louisiana. For more information and to jumpstart your career or to restart your career once we can all go back to work, make sure you visit talkmobilenet.com, our primary sponsor.
Welcoming Dennis to the hall is Phil Jackson from the class of 2007. Ladies and gentlemen, Dennis Rodman.
Welcome back to the Hard Parking Podcast. This is the special Last Dance edition. This is episode 205. Coming back this week, we have Brian Calma, good friend of mine, diehard sports fan. Brian, glad to have you back on.
Glad to be back on, man. Thanks for having me.
This week it's just you and I, so we'll probably end up talking for 4 hours.
Right. It's what we did when we worked together anyway.
Episodes 3 and 4 were fantastic. So what I wanted to do is I had some thoughts kind of after episodes 1 and 2 that I wanted to share with you. And these are just random thoughts, either things I forgot to mention, and we could talk about them before we move forward. But first off, Jordan has back-to-back game MVPs as a losing. He was MVP of Game 1 and Game 2 in the 86 playoffs against the Celtics, which you don't see that very often. I did a little research, and Jerry West was the finals MVP as a loser in 1969. Jerry West averaged 38 points.
That's right. I have heard that, yeah.
When the Lakers fell to the Celtics.
The Celtics.
Yeah, the Celtics of all. Of course, in other sports, Chuck Howley of the Dallas Cowboys won the Super Bowl MVP on the losing end in 1971. So
do you remember when they were having this same conversation? I think that's when they brought up some of those same examples with Jerry West and was it Chuck Howley? Is that who you just said?
Chuck Howley for the Dallas Cowboys. Yep.
Yeah, because remember they brought this up. I think it was during the 2015 NBA Finals. So remember when it was LeBron basically versus the Golden State Warriors, right? Yep. And then it was LeBron carrying the team, and I think the Cavs took it to 6 games, right?
So that's the one that they ended up winning. I did a little research on that. So whichever year, maybe it was 2016, whichever one that they won in Game 7, that's the year they were talking about it.
Yeah, exactly. Yep.
Well, so it ended up not happening.
I'm pretty sure it was 2016 because I think it was the same exact year as the Cubs won the World Series and broke the streak. So
that's right. It was a great year for Cleveland.
Yeah, that whole Midwest area just had, a lot of stuff going on. So
it's 2016.
That was 2016, yeah.
That was 2016, yep. Because I had that Thai food and that fucking bitch made it like triple X hot. And yeah, during Game 7. And then Dwayne Wade was in discussion as being the finals MVP when Miami lost to Dallas.
Right.
Because he was I think through 5 games, he had the highest average of any player in NBA Finals history.
Right.
And then LeBron couldn't post up JJ Barea, and the rest is history. And also, Scottie had back surgery halfway through his contract, which was problematic for him. So they didn't really talk about that. So I can kind of understand maybe why Jerry Krause, not to give him an out, but was a little hesitant. So that's the notes I had from the last one. Moving on. Episode 3, Dennis Rodman.
Right.
What are some of your takeaways before I get into some of these topics?
Well, one of the first takeaways is Carmen Electra is still fine. So 50 years old, she's still looking good. And I noticed if she had any work done, it was probably very minimal because she still looks like herself. Props to Dennis Rodman on that. But no, I think from the perspective of, the shows itself, one thing that really stood out was we all know Phil Jackson to be this coach who's won a lot of titles, right? I think 11 titles as a head coach, right? I like part of the things that was kind of brought back to memory was that he was also a champion as a player, with the Knicks. And I didn't know that, before coming to the NBA that he had gotten a job as a head coach over in Puerto Rico, was it? And then won championships there, so it feels like at every stop that he went to, he won championships, and so like a good part of his professional basketball career, whether it was being a coach or being a player, was winning championships. So that was pretty cool to see that. But I think the biggest thing was that I like the way that the documentaries were produced in such a way where they were introducing Dennis Rodman and doing like kind of like the mini biography, kind of like what they did at the beginning of 1 and 2 with Michael and Scotty, but then tying into it like the history with the bad boy Celtics, you know. So I thought that was like a perfect bridge to kind of, you know, tread and, you know, kind of go back and forth on the timeline when they were looking at, hey, here's Dennis Rodman, here's kind of what his life looked like. But then let's go back to the Pistons because he was part of that bad boys group, you know. So that was pretty impressive to see how they told the story in that way.
Yeah, it was like a well-written paper, right? Because you have the main paragraph, and then they're taking a sentence from each paragraph, and they're highlighting a player. So we had Scotty last time in episode 2, primarily, and then we knew we were going to get Dennis in 3, and then 4 we get Phil, and then in 4, I'm getting a little ahead of myself, but in 4 they bring back all the timelines because you have the bad boys Pistons. So everything we learned so far. I think one of the cool things is, you know, Dennis Rodman studied his opponents so hard. And I thought about, as a football fan, Deion Sanders. That's what they would say, is he would sit there and he would study every wide receiver, and he would tell them on the field, he knew what they were going to do before they did it. And they were always in awe because people think of him as a big time, you know, shit talker, but they said he didn't say anything when he played ball. And I think when Jordan said that, you know, Dennis Rodman is one of the smartest players to ever play the game, you know, that's high praise from him. And I thought that, you know, because like, you know, I know when Michael shoots the ball, it's coming off short. When Magic shoots the ball, I need to be over here. And I'm just like, he's like a true scholar of the game. And I don't know, I was just kind of blown away by that.
Yeah, not a lot of people give him credit for the intelligence that he showed on the court, because I think a lot of it was kind of misdirected because of his antics when he started to color his hair and that kind of stuff. Like, people didn't really give him the credit that, you know, that was due. I don't know if you had watched the Dennis Rodman 30 for 30, you know, in his first few years with, you know, in the NBA with the Detroit Pistons. I mean, that guy was a workhorse, man. You know? And, you know, the scene where he was accepting the Defensive Player of the Year award, you know, broke down in tears because, you know, he just kept saying, this is all I ever wanted. So people don't give him credit for the work that he did when it wasn't game day. Kind of like the anti-Allen Iverson, right? You know, talking about practice. But
we talking about practice.
Like, guys like Dennis Rodman were the ones who, that's where they really like put in the work, right? So yeah, people don't give him enough credit for being that, you know. And I think that one thing that stood out to me too was, you know, during some of the early parts of the show yesterday, I think it was episode 3, where David Aldridge said that he's the best on-ball defender that I have ever seen in my life, you know. And I really needed to think about that, because I knew, like, okay, yeah, he was a Defensive Player of the Year, you know, of course, rebounding champion pretty much every year, but you never think of really the on-ball defense. But then the more I thought about it, was like, how many times did he get into like little scuffling matches and, you know, get under his opponent's skin? And it was because of that, you know?
Yeah, he was a bugaboo. He's the guy on the playground that you hate to cover you because you're like, this guy didn't even know how to play basketball. He's all over me. Get the hell off me.
Yeah, and you don't even have the ball, and, you know, he's on you like glue, right? Yeah, exactly, man. And he just won't leave your side no matter what. So yeah, that's perfect right there.
I think going back to a younger Dennis Rodman, because I have his book somewhere in storage, Bad as I Want to Be. And it's one of the few books that I've actually read because I hate reading. I've read that, and I read like the Deion's book and stuff like that.
Yeah.
And I remember the story of him in the car, you know, claimed that he fell asleep with plans on probably killing himself. We won't really ever know. But I'd forgotten that basically he was kicked out and basically lived in his friends' backyards for a couple of years. And that seems to happen with a lot of young people, regardless of, you know, the color of their skin. And it's just crazy that, you know, when you hear those stories, you're like, oh my God. And then he just stayed clean the whole time and all he wanted to do was play ball. Yeah. And how about when he went to school? Because one of the narratives of him is, it's like saying Deion can't tackle. And I hate to keep going back to Deion, but just there's some similarities in their stories for me as a super fan that, you know, Rodman he's a liability to the ball. He can't score. In college, even though it's a small school, he averaged 27 points a game.
Right. I mean, you look at that old footage, and I saw a lot of that footage on the 30 for 30. And you're like, you know, when you think about Rodman in the NBA, especially during the later years, he was really awkward, right? Like with his offensive game. Like when he'd make a layup or even a jump shot, he'd like put that fist pump in the air, you know, like he just, you know, won the championship. You know what I mean? But yeah, you look at that old footage from his his college days, And yeah, you could tell that he was the man. You know, he was a top dog on his team. He was doing all the scoring. And you think of it though, I mean, for guys to get drafted, you have to be able to score. I mean, how many role players actually get drafted, right? So you have to have some type of ability to put the ball in the bucket. But it's just one of those things where I think that he just transitioned from, from college to the NBA, knowing that when he got drafted by Detroit, all right, we got Isiah, we got Joe Dumars, Microwave, Rick Mahorn, Mark Aguirre. Like, okay, where do I fit in? Because he ain't going to get the ball, you know? So, all right, I'm going to go in there, go grab rebounds, play defense, which was things that he could already do. But it's just the way that he adjusted his game when he got to the pro level was what made him stay. And eventually made him the best at, two things, defense and rebounding, and that was his ticket to the Hall of Fame.
Yeah, and I think it was telling that, Isiah, and we'll talk about Isiah in a little bit later, but, he said when Dennis came there, he was just this super raw, innocent country boy. And I listened to SVP last night. I don't know if you saw that or not, but, he had John Sally on there and, Will Bond and Jackie Mack. And Jackie McMullen, she said she remembers she's been covering him for years and she's, good friends with Dennis. And she said that she stood outside of just before the player introductions. And when they said Dennis's name, the crowd was booing and he had tears in his eyes. He's like, why are they booing me? He was just so raw and didn't, understand.
Right.
And just think about the player he became. And it's almost as like his childhood was so strange and atypical that by the time he lost his father figure in Chuck Daly, is no longer his coach, and eventually, he would pass. It's almost just like wilding out, just like an 18-year-old going to college.
Yep, exactly. Yep.
Started drinking, did the hair, did just, whatever. Let's talk about, because I have some random notes here, and I want to skip away from Robin for a second, and let's talk about Ron Harper and Craig Elo in that situation, because I didn't know that.
Yeah, I didn't know that either. Yeah.
That was a hilarious story. Do you think, because Ron Harper, he's underrated. Mm-hmm. He's a valuable part of the second three-peat. He wasn't the same Ron Harper because he had, I think it was like a knee issue, right? Because he used to be like a high-flying dunker when he was with the Cavs.
Yeah.
But he's always been a pretty good defender, which, by the way, that Bulls team was stacked full of defenders, and no one ever talks about that because you had Dennis Rodman, Scottie Pippen, Michael Jordan. Two of them were Defensive Player of the Year. All of them were all defense.
Yeah,
I think Ron was probably all defense second team.
Right.
So 4 out of their 5 starting lineup, they could ball in the defensive end. But if Ron Harper is switched and he's on Jordan, do you think the result is still the same, or do you think it might be different?
You know what's so funny, man? Because the one thought that I had when I was watching it at that time was everybody knows, the shot over Elo, right? And then Jordan's in the air, pumping his fist. Nobody ever thinks about the preceding plays. Like, I didn't know, right? So it was really interesting to see that sequence of the final 3 plays of that game. So what I thought about was that, okay, you had Jordan hits that mid-range jumper. They get a 1-point lead. The next play, Cavs got the ball. Elo drives to the bucket, makes the layup. Cavs are up by 1.
Yep.
And then they talked about that piece that you're just talking about right now. And I thought about, the whole Marv Albert, shot over Elo, and all that kind of stuff. What if he did miss that shot? And the last image of that game is actually Craig Elo hitting the final shot of the game and winning it for the Cavs. How much that would have turned the world upside down, and we'd live in this alternate universe, right? But because that shot that he made over Elo, and it probably doesn't matter who it was in front of him. But that shot he made pretty much, was part of, the small events that changed the course for this Bulls team. It was like they just kept climbing the ladder, got past the Cavs, couldn't beat the Pistons, finally got to beat the Pistons. But really, to answer your question, do I think if Ron Harper was on him, would he have made? I think he would have still made the shot. I still do.
I agree. If you look at just the physics of that play, no one was stopping Jordan anyway.
Right.
There were no Jordan stoppers. But to get the ball, dribble left, stop on a dime, jump straight up, the defender is still trailing. The defender's going to go right past. He may look a little more graceful than Elo looked flying by.
Right.
But then the double pump in the air, like nobody was doing that.
Yeah.
So even if Harper was right there, by the time Harper came down, Jordan is still in the air and shooting the ball. Right. So I also think that he still makes that shot. Yeah. And then, you know, no one's making fun of Craig Elo for the rest of his career because he was a damn good player.
He was a good player. I remember when he came to the Sonics. You know, he had a good like 1 to 2 year run with the Sonics when he came over. You know, I think he ended his career there actually. But no, Craig Elo was always one of those guys when you thought of the Cavs from late 80s, early 90s. You thought Mark Price, Brad Daugherty, Larry Nance. I know Larry Nance was probably earlier than that, but then Craig Elo was always on that list. You know, I'm forgetting 1 or 2 players, but I mean, you know, he was definitely on the list of, you know, good players on that Cavs team.
You're right, man. It's one missed shot away from who knows what happens.
Right. Exactly.
Right? I mean, we don't know. But one thing we agree on is Ron Harper's not stopping Jordan from making that shot either.
I don't think so. I think probably the only person who probably could have, you know, maybe even got close to defending that shot was if, say, Brad Daugherty was up on him and if he was on
right, a center.
Close. Yeah, close. Because, I mean, like you said, the double pump was what did it. Because if you look at Elo, even though Elo wasn't there on time, his hand was still up, you know?
Yep, he was just flying by like,
right, yeah.
Oh, shit. Exactly. How is he still in the air?
Yeah.
So fast forward back to the modern day, because I took some notes on this after the fact. Because what I do when I'm listening is I just whip open my phone and take voice notes.
Yeah.
And ask myself questions and then go back. So we'll go back to current as far as 2000, as far as 1997, 1998 era of Dennis Rodman. One of the things I noticed, first off, just a side note, and I haven't seen people do this since Dennis, and I know it cost them a lot of money. He didn't care because he was genuine. Every game he would take his jersey off.
Right.
And throw it in the fans or give it to somebody. And it doesn't have to be some dying kid, you know, just any random person.
Yeah.
And good Lord, that was awesome. And he did that with San Antonio. I think he started doing it with San Antonio.
Yeah, I think so too. Yeah.
Yeah. And then continued with Chicago. So now all players do is they trade jerseys with each other.
Right. Yep.
So Rodman wants time off. And that was an awesome story. And I think John Sally was saying it, or somebody was saying that they had to hold on to that for all this time. Like nobody ever talked about that story of him going to Vegas. I mean, we opened up about it with Carmen Electra.
Right. Yep.
But thinking of the episode afterwards and the whole Jerry Krause dynamic, it probably didn't help matters much that Phil says, Mike, what do you think about this? What do you think we should do? And just completely blocked out Jerry Krause, the general manager, who is the one who really makes these type of decisions. That probably didn't do too much good.
Right. No, I mean, it's one of those things where, you know, at that time, it's like, you know, that this team's going to get blown up anyway. So, you know, why not? Dennis needs a little bit of time. Shoot, let him go, you know? But I thought it was funny, though, that he consulted MJ about that. And even though MJ was like, hey, you let him go on vacation, he ain't coming back. You let him, you let him go on vacation to Vegas, we know he ain't coming back. But they went ahead and did it anyway, you know, and nobody knew about the story, like you said. And it's just those things. And I touched on it on the last episode of this podcast, that one of the biggest things that, you know, also caught my attention was the things that really made it tough for them to win the championship that year. So, you know, like with Scotty being injured at the beginning of the year, being out for a couple of months, them going on a little bit of a losing streak and not having a really great record to start off their season. And then you put in the fact that now Dennis wants to go on vacation mid-season, you know, just all the different things that, you know, they had to manage in order to, you know, just keep winning and try to get that 6th title is just incredible. You won't see that ever again. I don't think that, you know, any team would ever let any of their players, let alone one of the superstars, go on vacation mid-season. You know, like you hear about some guys who leave the team for personal reasons. Like I think one of the most recent ones that I can think of is like Derrick Rose when he was with the Knicks, right?
Oh yeah. Everyone's like, what do you mean you haven't heard from him?
Yeah, exactly. You know, who knows what, you know, why he really left and all that kind of stuff. But I think it's just so funny to hear that Dennis just wanted to go on vacation, go to Vegas and party it up. Hey, to his credit, he came back and probably came back better than ever, after that leave.
Right. I mean, it's good Lord, the way they ended the episode with him getting on the bike. I mean, it's like, oh, what a way to end the episode,
Well, drinking a Miller Lite first before getting on the bike, right? I mean,
right, man. And then one of the things when they would show a little bit of him as a bad boy, and they showed more of it in episode 4, but one of the things that I had an epiphany, because one of the things they always say about players now is like they couldn't survive back then. And my thought is they're just two different eras, and maybe they could survive. They would just have to adjust.
Right.
It's not what they're used to, but it's not like you're just going to, zap the top 10 players back to the mid 90s.
Right.
They would have came up in that era and they'd still be good players. They'd just be more physical.
Right.
Just kind of an interesting thing. I'm transitioning over to episode 4, and I have a question for you. When you saw episode IV on the screen, did you think about Star Wars?
Of course. Of course I did.
I was like, I made that as a note. I go, I wonder how many people saw episode IV and thought Star Wars.
Of course, man. Of course I did.
That's funny.
Like that. Come on. Yeah.
That's funny. So this is basically the Phil Jackson, Doug Collins introducing Tex Winter episode, still with plenty of Dennis and plenty of Scotty. Overall, what did you think about this episode before we kind of jump into things?
Yeah, like I really paid attention to the Doug Collins part, because really, before Phil Jackson, the only other coach that I had ever really knew that Jordan had was Doug Collins. I really didn't know about Stan Albeck. I knew that Doug Collins was the coach, and I really only knew Doug Collins growing up because he was a sportscaster. He was one of the analysts, right, on all the telecasts. Yep. I guess what I learned from this about him is that I didn't know how positive an impact that he had on Michael Jordan.
Right.
You can tell that they had a really good working relationship. I think it's mostly because Doug Collins really ran that offense through Jordan, and
100%. Yep.
He wanted that. And I know that a little bit later on in the episode, they start talking about the implementation of the triangle offense and how MJ was kind of averse to it, because he was just fine with the way that the offense ran through him under the Doug Collins regime. And so just kind of seeing that, and then the transition to eventually having Phil come in as an assistant coach, and which another thing too is that, like, I didn't know that that's kind of the way that it was done back in the day, because you think about coaching regimes now, whatever the sport, right? Basketball, baseball, football, whatever. You hire the head coach, right, first, and then they bring in their own staff. But,
right.
But it was Jerry Krause, and he had to do it twice. He had to try it twice to bring Phil Jackson into the mix, because he got the thumbs down the first time he tried to bring Phil Jackson in there, and finally he got him into the second time around, right?
Because he showed up dressed like a hippie for an interview.
Yeah, exactly, right. Which is funny though, because that's funny that you bring that up, because did you catch the part when they were going to bring Dennis Rodman onto the team, and then when Phil was talking about the very first time him and Dennis met, Dennis just sat there, didn't even stand up to shake his hand, and then Phil was like, "Come on, Dennis, stand up. Let's shake hands.
Stand up." Yep.
Yeah. So it's kind of like almost, that same first impression that Phil made, when he didn't get the job, right? Like came in, underdressed and all that. So I thought that was kind of a funny parallel between him and Dennis Rodman. But yeah, that was one of the biggest things, because growing up, I was just so fixated on the team, knew all the players and all that. But then, I knew the coaches' names, but I just didn't know kind of the transition from Doug Collins to Phil Jackson. And I thought that was a really interesting transition and how it ended up.
Yeah, because if you look on the bench, you see a lot of the same guys. Jimmy Clemens was there forever, and Chip Schaefer was there forever. And it's just like, I didn't know that transition either. I knew that Doug was in and then Doug was out and Phil took over. But I didn't realize that Doug's offense was basically just give the ball to Michael at the end of the game. And it makes sense why, he had the ball in his hand the whole time. He kept scoring, but they couldn't really do anything.
Right.
And he started trusting, his teammates even before the triangle.
Right.
But I understand why and I had heard and I knew already that they were resistant to the triangle offense.
Mm-hmm.
One of the things I didn't know is that Tex Winter was pushing that since like 1960. So he'd been pushing that shit for like 30 years.
Right.
Before they finally, anybody actually gave him a chance. But it was, I picture yourself as Tex Winter. I mean, he had to been like, he was just chill. I don't know if he had the master plan the whole time.
Right.
But he's like, all right, I'll do what you want. And then obviously with Doug Collins being like, I don't like this guy. I'm going to move him, somewhere else away from the bench. I'm going to put him up in the freaking scores table, wherever the hell he had him. I mean, that was kind of a defiant move.
Right.
And at that time, obviously, Phil Jackson being the new blood, he and Jerry Krause got along great.
Right.
And then eventually he, the rest was kind of history. So what about Jordan going to fetch Dennis Rodman? Like, can you imagine? Like, it couldn't have been just Jordan. Maybe it was just Jordan and his group of sniffers, which was a very awkward scene.
Right. Yeah.
Especially that first guy. Like, what was he? He looked like Larry Bird off of the video game.
Right. Exactly.
What was that?
Yeah. No, I couldn't. Like, I really couldn't imagine, Jordan having to go and get Dennis Rodman at that point in time, because especially with Jordan being the guy who, he is the face of the team, the face of the league. And then having to go out of his way in the middle of the season to go and get some guy who, who he trusts to be one of his running mates, and then to go and pluck his ass out of Vegas. I couldn't imagine, just again, the pressure of having to deal with Scotty's injuries at the beginning of the year, the Bulls not winning, and having to, then deal with this. Like, I don't even know. There must have been just like, Jordan must have been just like a dormant volcano at that point in time.
I remember the Bulls struggling, and I didn't remember why. And I always thought maybe because, they've won, 5 championships, going for their 6th championships. They're the oldest team in the league. They're just getting worn down.
Right.
Because teams always, and really, if they're healthy, if Dennis doesn't hold out and in the middle of the year or the middle of the summer, and if, Pippen is full strength, because they got off to a rough start.
Yep.
They got off to a really rough start. And you think about, well, maybe their record wasn't great because they were bored.
Right.
But that's not even the case. Maybe they were a little bit, but they were just kind of struggling. And then the distraction with Jerry Krause, and it's just
right.
I didn't realize it. I guess I kind of remember now that Dennis kept checking out on him mentally. Mm-hmm. But, that was kind of like, oh, yeah, I forgot about that. But, they kind of explained more with his usage. It's like, I don't want to have to be the man. And now I am the man behind the man. And now I'm not that guy anymore. I guess I'm not needed. Yeah. I'm just going to go to Vegas or whatever, get my head on straight.
Yeah. And I think that, like, out of any team that I'd ever seen to, have multiple titles, I don't know if there's any other team that may have had that much weighing down on them. It's probably because we don't hear, all of the different ins and outs of what teams go through in a given season until, after it's all said and done. You know what I mean? But yeah, when you add all that stuff up, that you just mentioned, I just, again, it's just astonishing to know that they still won the damn title. That would have broken any other team, I think.
One of the things I have written down here in thinking about episode 3 and 4 is I really liked how they continued Rodman into episode 4. And then they brought in, you got more of the Scottie Pippen's story. And then when they're showing the Bulls, because it's like, okay, you have Rodman, you start 3 with Rodman.
Yeah.
You touch on Scottie a little bit. You touch on Phil. You touch on Tex Winter and Doug Collins. And then you introduce a triangle. And you show them going the first time and losing with the triangle, going back the second time. And now everything's coming full circle. Now there's Dennis, the main guy from episode 3, is a main guy in episode 4, but as a member of the other team, the hated rival. Right. Yep. And then the highlights, they show Jordan and Pippen putting in work. And this is the first time so far in 4 episodes where you actually saw a large chunk of Pippen highlights for a section that wasn't just Pippen. It was finally about the Bulls busting through that. And we also really started to understand the dynamic between Phil and Dennis and Mike and Scotty and Phil. Yeah. And it's like they had their, like those 4, obviously, they were the nucleus of the Bulls. But I mean, Jerry Krause, Reinsdorf, nowhere to be seen. No one cares about them. The rest of the team, they're there. They're the role players. But I don't understand. So when they finally beat the Pistons, and there's this, I made a note of this, and maybe you were thinking the same thing, maybe you weren't. I don't understand the relevance of Kool Moe Dee's, how they like me now. And it looked like, they were wearing the three-peat shirts already. So it's like they jumped through their first three-peat. Then they went back to the 91 finals. I mean, was I missing something?
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, I think it's probably just Easter eggs. You know what I mean? Like with the three-peat shirts and all that kind of stuff. Because I kind of caught that too. And I was just like, wait a minute. If I'm doing the math right here, you would only be going into the second one, And so I think that it was just, doing their editing and trying to get like cool shots in the middle of, panning from one subject to another. And it's probably the shirt that was inside like Jordan's jacket, right? That you're talking about.
Yep. When he was in the back of the bus or whatever, the flight. Yeah. And maybe they forgot to put it in episode 1 because remember they opened up episode 1 just like we knew they would with them doing the first three-peat.
Right.
And it's just like, it was a weird time jump for me. It just didn't really make sense.
Yep.
Going back to the finals, I remember watching on Hardwood's Classics game 1 of the 91 finals.
Right.
And we knew that Chicago was the underdog.
Mm-hmm.
And they lost game 1. I want to say in either overtime but I know that Jordan took the last shot and it went in and out.
Right.
So they were an in and out shot. Like it literally went boom, in and out away from sweeping the Lakers.
Right. Right.
And no one ever talks about that, but that's crazy.
Yeah. And then, they even, talked about that and they were saying they were having a bad game. I think it was MJ who said that we weren't even playing that well and we still could have beat them.
Yep.
What I was thinking about when they really started to highlight that 91 finals though, was when I really started to get into NBA basketball was probably in the late 80s. So I was probably like 9, 10 years old at the time. And then it was pretty much in the advent of the Bad Boys, because I do remember being little and watching the Bad Boys, win their 2 titles, right? But then, I had always liked the Bulls too, because at that point during the Eastern Finals, it was always Chicago and Detroit. But then it was my attention was always watching Jordan and I think it was his style of play, right? It really caught my eye. It was graceful. It was like moves you've never seen. So I had always rooted for the Bulls to one day be in the finals and beat the Pistons. And then I really started to pay attention when they went up against the Lakers in that 91 finals. And it was kind of like going down, back down memory lane. And it was awesome. The one move that I had seen, and that's so iconic Jordan, is when he drives down the lane, goes up right-handed. He sees Sam Perkins down to the right, who he thinks is going to go up to block the shot, reverses in midair, goes up with the left hand. And of course they use that, that image, that replay for the Be Like Mike commercials for Gatorade and all that.
Everywhere.
Everywhere, right? And then so, that kind of brought back, some really good memories seeing that footage. And yeah, that was kind of the start of my NBA fandom. So, but at that point in time, I didn't know that they were such, big underdogs, and it's probably just because like 10-year-old me was like, oh, Bulls, please win, because I just wanted them to win the title so bad, but did not have any clue that they were such big underdogs going into that series.
I have a hot take about that shot.
Okay.
It might be the most well-known yet most unnecessary shot Jordan's ever taken in his entire career. Because when you see it from the side, you're like, what are you looking at, bro?
Yeah.
There's nobody there. I mean, Perkins is there, but he's flat-footed,
Yeah, you could say that he was probably showboating, right? Because you see all the highlights, right? And then, he does all these up and unders, all these reverses, and they're contested,
Yeah, people all around him.
This was probably the least contested shot that he's ever taken, but it just looked so good. The camera angle was perfect too. I mean, everything about it was like, a moment in time. But
2 big things out. Yeah, I'm sorry, go ahead.
No, I was going to say, you're right. It's probably the most unnecessary shot that he's ever taken. But
yeah, I'm glad. I mean, I know that's kind of a hot take, but if you just break it down, you're like, what? Why? Yeah. Like, what are we doing? No other defender up there with him. He says he saw Perkins to his right. That's why he did it, because he thought Sam was going to come up and try to block the shot. Muscle memory, I guess.
Yeah, he was up in midair by himself. So, but yeah.
Two big things I want to cover before we close. Let's go back to the Pistons and that big controversy. Mm-hmm. And I want to give Zeke actually a shout out for sitting here and doing this docuseries.
Yeah.
Knowing that Mike probably hates his guts, or, still really dislikes him enough. And we don't know. I mean, they could be cordial, but Mike as a competitor could be like, I hate him when he's on the Pistons, but I don't hate him.
Right.
Some pretty funny moments, but what are your thoughts about that controversy with how they left the court? And I watched SVP a little bit after this, so I got a little bit more context on it. But what are your initial thoughts?
Yeah, well, so it's pro sports, right? So I think something that we both can go back and forth on again too. Sportsmanship is important, right? Well, to a point, I think, because growing up, I grew up playing baseball and basketball, right? My whole youth. They preach sportsmanship, no matter what.
Good game.
Yeah, good game. Shake their hand after the game and all that. But I think I'm also of the attitude where if you are good enough to make it to the pro level, I don't think that shaking hands at the end of the game is necessary. I don't, right? Because I think it's more highlighted in this scenario because it was two all-time great teams in the NBA and it was in the Eastern Conference Finals, right? So a lot on the line and everything is magnified. And, especially in the way that the Pistons did it, the game wasn't even over yet. And then as a group, and I guess it looked like Bill Laimbeer was the one who kind of spearheaded it and was like, fuck this. We ain't shaking hands. Let's get the fuck off the court, right? So they go before the final whistle blows. You know what I mean? And then you got that panning shot of Jordan and the rest of the bench just watching them go on by. But do I think that, it was kind of dirty, bush league, unsportsmanlike? I don't know. I don't think so. Because they also had that piece in there where John Paxson called out, where the Celtics, went off the court when the Pistons beat them, right? And then Isiah actually went and grabbed Kevin McHale, and then they shook hands, but Isiah had to initiate the contact first. So, hey, the Celtics did it. So why didn't it get as much, attention, I guess, or maybe it did back in the day, but it's not as much highlighted because I don't think it's got that tie to the dream team either, like it does right now. But my biggest, kind of conclusion about the whole thing is that MJ made a big deal about it because for years, the Bulls were just beat the fuck up by this team. They were the mountain that they just couldn't summit. And even though they lost all those Eastern Conference Finals, Jordan and the rest of the team shook their hands, wished them good luck on the next round. And I think it's that big brother, little brother type of thing where your big brother kicks your ass over and over again. But when you finally get big enough and strong enough to win, you want that validation. You want them to at least look at you and address you and, give you the pat on the back. I think really that's what it's stemming from because, like I said, you get up to that level and shaking hands isn't a requirement. I mean, how many regular season games end and then both teams just go their separate ways? Except
for like 2 or 3 people.
And they were probably previous, teammates on teams in college or on the pros, right?
Right, so. Yeah. I think it was Bush League, and part of that was media spin. Mm-hmm. Looking back and knowing what I know, I still think it was kind of fucked up. But I think when Zeke said that, Bill said, let's go, at first I was like, oh, there he goes, blaming Bill Laimbeer, trying to blame somebody else for this.
Right.
But John Sally said that it was Bill as well. And Bill said that he goes, let's send them off the way that the Celtics, sent us off.
Yeah.
And I think part of it was because they just hated, they were sick of the Bulls. The Bulls clearly hated the Pistons more than the Pistons hated the Bulls. It's like college football. We're both big college football.
Right.
Fans. It's like Michigan and Ohio State are rivals.
Right.
No matter how badly Michigan State wants to call Michigan their rival, it's a one-sided rival.
That's right.
Even though they're, and it's like here in Arizona, right? Because it was, what do they call it?
The Territorial Cup.
Yeah. But, ASU and U of A.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
It's kind of the same deal. And
mm-hmm.
So I understand why the Bulls hated Detroit. Obviously, you saw it in the documentary. You saw it in all the footage forever. But I think a part of it was we don't respect them for beating us. I think a part of it was, well, let's just do what the Celtics did to us,
right.
As almost like a big brother, the opposite way you're saying, almost like, little brother, congratulations, but you're not getting none of this. You're not getting you haven't done nothing yet.
Right.
So I think some of it was that. They haven't talked about it, but one thing John Sally said was he actually asked Chuck Daly to go back into the game to finish the game because he didn't want to walk past Michael because they were friends. So he actually asked to stay on the court.
That's interesting.
And be respectful. Because, I mean, he felt, he knew that that's what they did, and it was a little disrespectful.
Right.
But I think in the episode, I think Jordan is actually a little wrong here, but I understand how petty he is.
Yeah.
Because he's not going to let anything go.
Yeah.
And, Zeke, thinking back, he said, yeah, we may have done it differently just because of the backlash that we received.
Right.
Well, Bill Laimbeer is the guy who says, no, I wouldn't change a thing.
Yeah, exactly.
Yep. But I think being able to think about it years later and be like, that probably wasn't the best thing to do at the time, regardless of how he felt. It was big of Isiah to say that, right. I mean, Jordan's like, he's probably going to say, thinking back, blah, blah, blah. But that's growth. There's nothing wrong with that.
Right.
And I thought it was hilarious. Go ahead.
Let me ask you this, though, because this ran through my head also when they started talking about the 91 finals against the Lakers. So same kind of situation, right? So you got, it's not necessarily big brother, little brother, because it's different conferences. But the Lakers, and I believe Magic with the Lakers had won 5 titles, if I'm not mistaken. Okay. And so they were going for number 6. Bulls beat them in 5. And the one thing that I thought was very interesting was when Magic was talking about how he went over towards their locker room to go and congratulate Jordan, shared a really nice moment, big hug, congratulations, and all that kind of stuff, right? You strip away a lot of the layers, though, and it's very similar because the Lakers are past champions, right? The Pistons were past champions. I would say that the Lakers were just as big of a mountain to, for the Bulls to climb, right? And it was for all the marbles this time around. So what do you think is the biggest difference in how Magic Johnson handled this situation versus Isiah handling the situation? Part of me thinks that maybe Bill Laimbeer, had a big influence on that because everybody says, well, Zeke was the ringleader on that show, right? He was the ringleader on the Bad Boys. But I think just looking at the footage from yesterday that Bill Laimbeer was pushing for it and say, fuck this, let's just walk past them. No handshakes, nothing. So what's the difference between how the Lakers handled it and how the Bulls handled it?
I think that...
excuse me, the Pistons, not the
Yeah, I got you. I think with the Lakers, Magic Johnson was clearly their leader. He's clearly one of the biggest names. I mean, I don't think the Bad Boy Pistons were the Bad Boy Pistons. I mean, it sounds like nobody really respected him, period.
Right.
And you have Showtime, and he's a professional. He's got this smile that can light up, whatever. And so that didn't surprise me to hear him do that. I would expect him to do that. Yeah. But I think with the Pistons battling the Bulls so much, and then they had also said that Jordan had called them out.
Right.
It said a lot of bad things about him. So
calling them actual bad people or something.
Yeah, he said they're bad people. They're bad champions. They don't deserve that. And so if you're a 2-time champion, you're like, fuck this dude. He hasn't done nothing. He may be the best player right now, but he's not beating us.
Right.
So I think the Bad Boys keeping up with, their reputation and having some chips on their shoulders and finally getting their ass beat. Right. It wasn't close. They got their ass beat by their little shit talking brothers. They're like, forget these punks. And I think, for me, that's probably the biggest difference. What's your thought?
Yeah, I think so too. And I also think that it's one of those things where it's the Bad Boys that they had to uphold that name, kind of like the chip on your shoulder kind of moniker that you mentioned. And I also think too that just kind of the difference with Magic, and you say that he was the leader of the team, absolutely, because when he was young and got drafted by LA, he learned under the wings of like Kareem. He had guys like James Worthy on his team. And so they weren't the Bad Boys. You know what I mean? It was one of those things too, where I think just
Showtime Lakers.
Yeah, exactly. And also you think about it this way too. This just popped into my head and I can't believe I didn't think about this before. But then you look at back in the 80s, the biggest rivalry back then was the Lakers and the Celtics, right? And it wasn't one-sided. And it was a respected rivalry because it was actually a rivalry that started back in the 70s when Larry Bird was at Indiana State and when Magic was at Michigan State. So they had been going at it since then. And then they get to the pros and they go at it and it's going back and forth. They each win titles off of one another. So I think that now thinking about it and talking it out with you, there was more of an appreciation coming from somebody like Magic because he had his rival, but it was a different dynamic because him and his rival, him and Larry, weren't they weren't passing by each other. They weren't pushing each other off to the side when one of them won and the other lost. There was a deep respect there. That's what I think is probably the biggest difference, because Magic had a much different experience than Isiah had, on his journey to his back-to-back championships.
Like, the NBA is in great hands type of deal.
Right.
And I can rest easy.
Yep.
Type of deal.
Yep. And I think that a lot of people did see Jordan as being the guy who was going to be the torchbearer. And maybe that's something that Isiah saw and was like, well, shit, I ain't chopped liver. We've won 2 championships. We went back to back beating them. Right.
And all y'all care about is the Bulls.
Right. Exactly. So, I can see why. And like I said, it kind of goes with, the handshakes and the sportsmanship. Really, it's not required, but I can see why. Especially if Jordan was going at him personally and saying shit. And that's what I heard Bill Laimbeer talking about on TV today, was that was kind of the thing that brought it over the cliff for him, was that he was talking about us as people. He doesn't know our families and, things like that. We were just basketball players.
Do you believe him?
Bill Laimbeer? I think as a dad, and then you're a dad too, I believe that piece. I believe that piece where, he doesn't know us as family men. But I also think that Bill Laimbeer is one of the biggest bullies and, punk motherfuckers in the game.
Absolutely, yeah.
So it's not surprising that he would be, the guy who'd be like, we're not shaking hands, let's just go to the fucking locker room. I think that he's 100% responsible for that action, for sure.
Yeah, because when they were going over the Jordan rules, like, okay, if Jordan goes over here, double team him. If he goes over here and if he gets in the paint, put him down.
Yep.
Put his ass on the ground. And they weren't like, oh man, I don't really want to do that. It wasn't like, so one of our old school favorite movies, Karate Kid.
Yeah.
It's not like when he told him to sweep the leg.
Right.
Do you have a problem with that? No.
Right.
He felt bad. He didn't want to sweep his leg, but
like
they were happy to do it. One last thing I want to talk about, and it's too bad we don't have more people on the phone.
Yeah.
Or on this call, because you and I kind of lean kind of the same direction on this.
Right.
Big time. This is a Phil Jackson question.
Okay.
And I thought about this because LeBron and Phil have had issues. Phil had referred to LeBron as, LeBron and his posse.
Right.
And LeBron blew it way out of, proportion. Like he does a lot of things in the past. He's a little better now. So, but do you think watching this piece and seeing how Phil fit in well with the pieces on his team and how everybody respected him for allowing them to be themselves.
Mm-hmm.
Do you think a part of that might have him, even if he never comes out and says it, maybe getting a little bit more respect for Phil Jackson than he's had in the past, where he's kind of like, this guy's from yesteryear. He had great players. That's probably why he won. He's just, in the right place at the right time. Or do you think maybe part of LeBron is pissed off because he never really had a Phil Jackson, because he would just burn through coaches. He never had really a Zen, like a Zen-based coach. He's had 2 that are pretty close.
Right.
But what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, so I think that I never really agreed with Phil Jackson's a great coach because he had Michael Jordan and because he had Kobe and Shaq. I don't believe that, because my biggest reasoning for that is because these guys that make it to the league who are superstars and who are paired up with other superstars, you know how many egos are going around in a very small space? The coach not only has to be a strategist when it comes to your X's and O's, but he has to be a strategist with how to juggle these egos and all these personalities. What's going on the court and off the court. And we touched on it earlier. His fucking leading rebounder and defender going off to Vegas in the middle of the fucking year. How do you navigate around that? You know what I mean? So, I know that for me, that, seeing a little bit more intimately how he did go about negotiating all of the different personalities in the room and bringing them together, for one common goal, I definitely have a lot more respect for Phil Jackson because of, his ability to rein everybody in and, to get them to, get the final result. You always hear about him and being the Zen master and being, having all these different ideologies and, ways of thinking that he wanted to pass on to everybody. He was different, I didn't know he fucking held yoga sessions on the court during practice and shit like that,
Yeah, I knew about that. I knew, yeah.
I had no idea, but he did a lot of unconventional things that, really, I think, heightened everybody's mental awareness of the game. Like, he knows every piece of that team from your superstar to the end of the bench made it to the league on their own accord. But as a unit, he had to be that guy to orchestrate this team to win their championships. And so, and I think at the end of it, for Michael to say, I will not play for any other coach other than Phil Jackson sounds a lot. And it's interesting that you bring up, LeBron in this case, because I really never thought about this. So this is really interesting for me to talk about this with you because, and I brought it up the last episode that LeBron is very demanding when it comes to what coach he wants because when he went back to Cleveland, David Blatt was the guy. He didn't like him. David Blatt was the coach, brought him to the finals, but he was gone the very next year. Tyronn Lue comes in, and I guess that was, I don't know if LeBron handpicked Tyronn Lue, but I mean, it was a good choice. It was a very good choice. He goes over to LA. It was Luke Walton, right? And now Luke
no
Walton's
respect.
out.
Get him out of here.
Yeah, exactly. Luke Walton's out. Now it's, what's his name?
Frank Vogel.
Yeah. So I think one thing that, now that I think about it, because you asked this question, Michael had such a deep and profound respect for Phil that's one aspect that I think LeBron will never have.
LeBron doesn't like Phil Jackson. I don't think he respects Phil Jackson.
Right.
And, he may have said all the right things about being respectful of him, but as soon as that whole posse thing came out, it became obviously clear that he tried to make it a race thing. Sure. And, Phil Jackson's a racist. He's an old man, blah, 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 blah. I'm putting words in his mouth, but those are the optics.
Right.
But in watching, episode 4, what do you think LeBron is thinking now that he's seeing how much people really appreciated Phil and who Phil really was as a coach?
Right. Right. Yeah. I think that, LeBron has to be, kind of regretting his words. You know what I mean? And honestly, when, going back to the whole posse thing, I don't think it had anything to do with race coming out of Phil's mouth. I don't think
that didn't. That was bullshit. That was those people trying to spin shit.
Right. Exactly. I don't think that was his, intention at all. But, I think at the very least with seeing, all of the, background footage and then hearing Phil talk about all these different players, he has to respect him in the way that he lets his players have freedom, and lets them be themselves, lets them say what they need to say. You can almost argue that during that time that Phil was heading up the Bulls, and he might have done this as the Laker coach too, but he was holding the epitome of a democracy, right? He was letting his players, especially the leaders, have their say, and he was letting the guys who needed to lash out from time to time do what they needed to do. But
still would step in and put his foot down when he had to. I wonder how many players are watching that last night and they're thinking, man, I wish I had Phil Jackson, man. That is so dope. That is so dope.
Yeah. And that's why I'm saying, like, I never had subscribed to the idea that, just because he had some of the greatest players of that era between Michael, Scottie, Dennis, and then having Kobe and Shaq, that's not what made Phil Jackson a great coach. I mean, again, going back to the beginning of this episode on this podcast, I didn't know that he was a champion like in Puerto Rico, right?
Right. I mean, I knew he won some in the NBA as a player, but
yeah, exactly.
Man, that's some funny shit.
He was a champion at every level. So no, like seeing all that now completely after watching these 2 episodes, you can't knock Phil for just having superstars because any lesser coach would not have gotten the job done, right? I mean, you could argue that Doug Collins was on the doorstep of being the guy, right?
Yeah, but he didn't want to accept that offense.
Exactly. Because I was just going to say that he was one decision away from being the guy, having Phil Jackson on his bench and Tex Winter on his bench too, and possibly still being champions. Jerry Krause was a GM. He probably, eventually would have maybe done the same, moves in terms of their personnel. Phil was the guy.
So what do you want to see in episodes 5 and 6?
So I saw some teasers and read some stuff about maybe, and I don't know if this is true, but are they inserting some Kobe Bryant stuff in the next couple episodes?
I think so. Yeah, I think so. It's probably a lot of Kobe interviews.
Yeah, I don't think I'm quite ready for that yet. And one subject that I was hoping that we were going to touch on this, podcast episode was the Dream Team, right?
We still can.
Yeah, because one of the things that I think, they touch on a lot and, over the years that they have is that because of the way that things ended with the 91 Eastern Conference Finals, was that kind of the final nail in the coffin, when it came to Isiah not being put on that Dream Team. Because, if you think about this, right? And
Had to have been.
here's the two things that stick out in my head about this. So I had watched the Dream Team documentary on NBA TV twice in the last couple months, right? So they lightly touched on Isiah Thomas. Number one, the thing that I thought was super interesting was that I forgot was that Chuck Daly was the head coach, right? The head coach.
How can you forget that?
Yeah, right. So you would think that, well, why would Jordan, joined up? And the thing was, Jordan already won a gold medal in, what was it, 84, 88?
84, yeah. And he and Chuck had actually a good relationship outside, which is kind of interesting.
Right. And I know that, and they also pointed this out in the documentary too, that, Jordan really was hesitant to do it, right? Because
he didn't want to do it.
Yeah, he won the gold, and who knows if if there was anything to do with Chuck Daly being the head coach of the Pistons, not necessarily Chuck Daly himself, but because of the tie to the Pistons. But yeah, if you think about it, also they, why the hell did they reserve a spot for a fucking college guy, right? It ended up being Christian Laettner. And all these years later, you think, well, it shouldn't have been Shaq, because Shaq was the number one draft pick the very next year, or right at 92. But if they had taken that spot and not given it to a college player, then maybe that would have been Isiah's spot, right? So
yeah, that's what they say. Yeah, man, that was right on the heels, and I can understand how a young, bitter, we just saw an old, bitter Michael Jordan last night. Now, I can definitely see how a young, bitter Jordan was like, I don't want to do it. Fine, I'll do it, but not if you bring Isiah.
Right. And I think that would have been the deal breaker if Chuck brought him on. But imagine being Chuck Daly, and I'm sure that Isiah was waiting for the phone call, right? Because
I wonder what that did to their relationship.
Exactly. Right. Because you start hearing, because one of the things too was that Michael was like waiting for who else was going to sign up to do it. Right. So then Scotty's in, Barkley's in, Magic and Larry are in. Once he heard all these names minus Isiah, that's when he was like, okay, count me in. Let's do this shit,
So going back to episode 5 and 6, because you're right. It seems to be trending toward Kobe for at least one of them, and I don't really understand why, at least right now. I mean, he was in the league by then, but it's just, I don't know. It's just like we said last time, it's still building the case for Jordan, letting all these young bucks know that they were a great team. He's the GOAT.
Right.
And I mean, that it is what it is. He signs off on all this stuff. Right. I'm not going to complain because we get to see it.
Right.
But I'm curious to see, take this. Obviously, I'm taking nothing away from Kobe being Bryant.
Right.
But I'm just curious to see where they're going to go with this. And, are we going to see Tony Kukoc, and because he was a pivotal part of that team, maybe we see more Ron Harper. I think they're probably going to go through the starting 5. Yeah. And I know Kukoc came off the bench sometimes, but I don't know. I'd like to see some Tony Kukoc.
Yeah, and I think that like some of the marketing posters that they put out there on commercials and stuff always have Steve Kerr on it, right? So
I noticed that.
I'm wondering if they're going to go into Steve Kerr, because if you don't know Steve Kerr's story, his father was a teacher that taught overseas, and I think he was in Beirut, Lebanon at the time, and then his father was actually killed. He was like assassinated, I think it was.
Yep.
While Kerr was playing at the University of Arizona, so. And of course, famed coach of the of the Golden State Warriors, and he's got a lot of spots, in the first 4 episodes where he's doing some commentary. You know what I mean? So I
was gonna say he started some of those games too. Depending on who they were playing, it would be Ron Harper or Steve Kerr.
Yeah.
My thought is the reason why he was on there is just for these young people to have some sort of recognition for somebody who's relevant in today's, because honestly, he really has no business being on the cover. He was a great shooter.
Yeah. Right.
But, that should have been Harper. That should have been Kukoc.
Right.
I don't see why it's Jordan, Pippen, Rodman, and then over in the corner, randomly just thrown in as Steve Kerr. It's just, no disrespect to Kerr. He's got some rings, and he did work for those rings for sure. He was a valuable. He won one of the games for him.
Yep. Yeah. Him and Paxson kind of have that parallel, right, between the first repeat and the last three, because they both hit game-winning shots.
Yep.
So,
yep.
It was Paxson in '93 against the Suns. And I think it was the first victory against the Jazz. I think it was the '97 series that
could be.
hit dagger, you know. So
yep. Thanks for being on. We'll talk again next week. Yeah. We'll see what happens.
Yep.
All right. Thanks, Brian. I gotta go eat dinner.
All right, man. Looking forward to it. Let's do steak.
That's tomorrow night.
All right.
All right. Later.
All right. Later.
I want to thank Brian Calma for joining the show this week. We were down a couple guests. We'll pick it right back up next week. One more thing about Dennis Rodman is it's good to see him get a lot of this shine because a lot of people didn't like him. He was public enemy number one. And that was the biggest thing that was confusing to have him on the Chicago Bulls, a team of excellence. Rodman wasn't perfect. You know, he got in a lot of trouble, you know, kicking reporters, you know, just doing a lot of crazy shit. You know, one thing I remember is the announcers, the game announcers, they weren't very kind to him either. You know, they were always very one-sided when it came to him when they were doing commentary. Like, it didn't matter if the other player did it first. You know, Rodman did it second because he's just such a terrible personality. He's a drain on the league. He's a drain on the Bulls. It's interesting looking back through the optics of history on how things can change over time. You know, history forgets the small stuff. And I think Dennis Rodman is a classic example of that. Can't wait to see what happens in episode 5 and 6 next week. Like I said earlier, we'll be joined by more people. Still need to thank my sponsors. Special thanks to the Passion Hi-Fi for providing the royalty-free music off of SoundCloud. If you guys like what you heard, please subscribe. And you can also support. There's a little support link on the main Anchor page. Doesn't take a lot, but make sure you tell somebody about this podcast. This isn't a sports podcast, although I consume sports literally 80% of my day. I can pretty much talk about anything. Talk about sports, talk about music, talk about cars. So remember that when you tell your friends when they ask you, what is the Hard Parking Podcast? Is it just cars? Everything but. We'll see you next week on this Last Dance edition. This is episode 2 of 5. Talk to you again on 3 of 5. I'm out.
Shut up!